So welcome everyone to the IHI Call Days. We are just starting our first session. Before we start, I just want to let you know that we are recording the session and we'll publish both the recording and the presentations on the IHI website. All information regarding future IHI call topics is indicative and subject to change. The final information about future IHI calls will be communicated after approval by the IHI Governing Board. Today's session will be focused on the single stage call rules and procedures and will be presented by my colleagues Desmond and Polyvios. Polyvios, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure to have you here today. My name is Polyvios Hadjiyangu, and I'm the coordinator of the scientific operations. And together with Desmond, our legal officer, we will present you the single stage rules and procedures. It's important to mention that the single stage now here, the presentation will focus on the call 3. We will have the final topic text publicly available with the adoption of the amended work program 2022 and the call publication hopefully this week. And the call 4, which is the two-stage calls, will be published in January following the work program of 2023. However, if you have any burning and urgent questions regarding the two-stage calls, please contact us, contact the program office, and we'll come back to you as soon as possible. Starting now with today's webinar for the call 3, the single stage, we'll go through the participation, the funding, and the intellectual property rules. We'll give you a little bit more information on the call process, the grant award. We'll go through the timelines of this call and some points to remember while preparing your application. Next slide, please. Regarding the participation rules, it is very important, though, to understand the structure of the single stage, especially for the ones who are new to the Horizon Europe, but also to IHI. Because in IHI, we envisage to have more single stage calls, which is more bottom-up approach and more flexible in terms of the application procedure. So the single stage, first of all, is an open call, and applicants are required to prepare a full proposal of 50 pages regarding the research and innovation actions, where all the public and private actors will come together and compete for funding. Of course, the applicants' consortia will be assessed based on the expertise that will provide in their proposal, so to reach the objectives. So these are specific requirements that are described in the call topic text and should be properly addressed. And because we're a public-private partnership, it will be required to cover the full value chain of the healthcare sector, so to meet the objectives of the call. So you will need to involve actors from the value chain, like I mentioned before, from academia, SMEs, large companies, regulators, etc. Next slide, please. Here, actually, you can see the schematic of the single stage call. Even though IHI holds the pen for drafting the topic text, we seek input from a wider research community, for example, from our members, our contributing partners. So the draft topic text will go through a consultation process with our advisory board, and then we'll have the final text adopted by the IHI governing board, and then we'll follow the publication of the call in the funding and interest portal with a specific deadline. After that, after we receive the submitted proposals, we'll go through the eligibility phase and then the evaluation process that is taking place by independent external experts. So IHI is not evaluating the proposals. This task is actually allocated to independent experts evaluators. Like I mentioned before, here in the single stage, it comes to a point that the applicants consortia will come together, like from academics, hospitals, regulators, patient organizations, small, medium, and large enterprises. It's important, though, here to mention that in IHI single stage calls, we have an eligibility criterion of the 45% that should be provided as a contribution by the consortium as a whole, but this specific aspect will be tackled later on through this presentation. The selected proposals, the one will be highly ranked. We'll go through the grant preparation phase with IHI, where hopefully then we'll sign the grant agreement. And of course, it's required to have a consortium agreement between the partners before finalizing this process. Next slide, please. So when the work program is published, all applicants should read carefully not only the topic text, but also the core conditions. During this slide, I will give you some of the highlights to draw your attention to some elements that they need to really take care while preparing their proposal. First of all, IHI is part of the Horizon Europe. Therefore, the Horizon Europe Work Program 23-24 shall apply mutatis mutandis to the Code 3, but is subject to some derogations that actually is reflected also in the work program. Importantly, for each topic, we have the indicative contribution, the JU contribution, and also give an estimate for how much one proposal in terms of the amount can cover for the specific tax. However, if applicants consider this amount can be different, this should be actually be aligned with your tasks in order to meet the objectives of the topic text. As I mentioned before, we will need to do the eligibility of the proposals in terms of the 45% eligibility criterion, which is actually the 45% should cover the actions eligible costs and the cost for additional activities related to the actions provided by the contributions were referred to in-kind contribution, financial contribution, and also additional activities, but this should be provided by private members of the IHI, their constituent or affiliate entities and contributing partners. This, like I mentioned, it will be covered through the slides, but don't forget that tomorrow we have a webinar on the budget and the financial aspects of the costs for proposals. So be ready for tomorrow to go on a step-by-step process with our colleague Gail, where I give you more information on these aspects. For the single stage calls, the page limit for the research and innovation actions is 50 pages. If applicants will provide more pages that go beyond the 50, experts will be instructed to stop at page 50, even though additional pages will not be visible for the experts. So you have to strictly remain within the page limits. For the proposals that envisage to have clinical studies, contrary to the previous calls of IHI, here you will need to use a dedicated annex template that is actually available in the system where you can provide more information on the clinical studies. Another aspect that should take into consideration for public bodies, research organizations, and higher education institutions of EU member states and associate countries is the gender equality plan. While you provide information in the proposal, you should self-declare that you have this plan, and this should be verified also by IHI if you're selected for funding afterwards. Because this is an eligibility criterion. Importantly, the plan, as also for the Horizon 2029 Horizon Europe, you will be required to provide a plan for dissemination, exploitation, and communication activities, which is also an admissibility criterion for this call. All the evaluated proposals will be ranked in one single list, the ones selected for funding, and based on the available budget per topic, we will go through with the selected ones to the grant preparation phase. Next slide, please. Another highlight for this call is also the affordability, availability, and accessibility of results, especially for products and services developed or partially based on the results of the clinical studies, should be affordable, available, and accessible to the public at fair and reasonable conditions, the so-called 3As. For core 3, we have the 3As applicable for topic 1, 4, and 5. And it's important while you're preparing your proposals, these specific aspects should be tackled within the plan for the dissemination, exploitation, and communication. There, you should identify potential and expected project results that may be subject to the 3A conditions, and also broadly outline the strategy to achieve these objectives. More information about the 3A in terms of the proposal and the implementation phase, the conditions that apply for this could be found in the work program 2022, the amended one, that will be publicly available, like I said, during this week. Next slide, please. Actually, the next one is about the participation rules, and I will give the floor to my colleague Desmond.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Polybios. So as discussed, my name is Desmond Barry. I'm one of the lawyers here at IHI. I'm going to cover some slides just in relation to things like eligibility for participation and funding, and also very, very briefly cover some of the points pertaining to the intellectual property rules. So starting off, as Polybios said, in relation to eligibility, in terms of who can participate in the IHI projects, it's any legal entity, regardless of its place of establishment, carrying out work relevant to the call objectives, may be part of an applicant consortia. So in general terms, if we have an actual legal entity, which can be a company or a person that's recognized under law, they're able to participate in the actual project. Now, as we identify in the box underneath, that is very, very different from eligibility for funding. I'm going to cover the funding in a next slide, but I think this is the first thing that's very important that everyone keeps in mind, that you can be eligible to participate, but you will not necessarily be eligible for funding. This slide we prepared to try and give a snapshot of the rules of who can actually be eligible for funding and what we need in an actual consortium to be considered eligible under the rules in the first place. So as you can see at the top, we're talking about the composition whereby a consortium can be regarded as eligible. And for a consortium that's going to apply, submit a proposal and apply under a call, we essentially have the language here which says that the consortium has to be composed of at least one independent legal entity, which is established in an EU member state, and at least two other independent legal entities, each established either in a different member state or an associated country. The key word there is independent. So essentially what that means is you can't have, for example, one company made up of three linked legal entities, which would then try and do a project all on their own. That's actually not possible. The legal entities must be independent from each other. And then below them, as I said, EU countries, I think that's self-explanatory. It's the member states, including their outermost regions and their overseas territories. The non-EU countries, which are beyond the immediate EU cluster, then we also have those that are associated to Horizon Europe. Those countries have signed association agreements or something similar with the EU, and they are clearly identified by checking the Horizon Europe program guide, which is underneath. And then also eligible for funding are the low and middle income countries. So if you look at the Horizon Europe associated countries and the low and middle income countries, then you'll see that the number of countries that are eligible for funding is actually quite broad. If you actually Google HE program guide, there's actually a full comprehensive list of these entities as well, and it's very easy to establish who is and who isn't actually eligible for funding for IHI projects. The last thing we would draw your attention to is in the bottom right-hand corner, where there's two kind of clarifications or qualifications here on the eligibility and the funding issue. For the UK, as we know, discussions are ongoing between the UK and the EU as to whether the UK are going to associate with the Horizon Europe programme. So the process that has been agreed within the Commission and the European institutions is that we will treat participants coming from the UK as being eligible for funding all the way through the proposal submission process, all the way through the evaluation process, and right up until essentially grant signature. When we'll look at it again, when the grant is going to be signed, we'll check to see if the right association agreement has been finalized between the UK and the EU. If it has not been finalized, then obviously UK participants will not actually be eligible for funding. So if you have UK participants in your consortium, in your proposal, and indeed it gets through the competitive process and it's approved for funding, then when you get to grant agreement signature, you may need to rework your consortium somewhat. The fact that your UK participants will not be eligible for funding from the IHI if the association agreement is not in place should be kept in mind by all of the consortia that have UK participants. And then the last point in the bottom right hand corner is we have Switzerland, and Switzerland are not associating with the IHI, or sorry, with the Horizon Europe programme. Therefore, they're not eligible for funding under IHI. It's our understanding, however, that Switzerland participants would be capable of receiving funding from the Swiss government, and there's a website and there's various procedures in place whereby they can avail of this funding from the Swiss authorities. Following on from that, then, just a very, very brief note in relation to the ongoing crisis in the Ukraine. Given the current situation, it has been decided that legal entities established in Russia, Belarus, or in any non-government controlled territories of the Ukraine are not eligible to participate in IHI projects in any way, shape, or form. Just in relation to the funding points then, as we said, so any legal entity established in a member state, associated country, or low and middle income countries, they're available for funding. Third countries generally are not eligible for funding. There are, however, exceptions for this where it's deemed essential that a given third country participant receives funding and gets involved in the IHI project. Such essentiality criteria are assessed at the proposal stage by the independent experts who evaluate the actual project. If you are part of a submission or part of a consortium which is submitting a proposal, and you're anticipating bringing in these third country participants and they want to receive funding, it should be made very clear in the actual proposal as to why they are essential, what they're bringing to the project, etc. For the single stage calls, as Plivius alluded to a few slides ago, because IHI runs both single stage and two-stage calls, there are slightly different rules in relation to the eligibility for funding, depending upon whether it's a single stage or two-stage. So because we're dealing with a single stage call here, we're using this slide, and as you can see, essentially it's very, very broad who can receive funding. Essentially, non-profit organizations, which includes the academics, the hospitals, the research organizations, etc., they can all receive funding, but also for-profit legal entities, which is the larger corporate entities, SMEs, large companies, they are eligible as well. So the idea is that in the applicant consortia, you will essentially have a mix of academics and larger companies, all of whom are eligible for funding, and this should be taken into account in the submission proposal as well. In relation to the rules, we added this slide just to provide some clarity. This is based on our experience from the earlier questions that we received during the course of 2022 and in earlier calls. So we're just kind of reminding everyone here of the language here in case they then go into the large number of online guides that IHI has produced and are available on the website, such as the guide for applicants, such as the upcoming guide for contributing partners, such as the financial guide. So The private member first, and these are essentially the industry associations who form what's called the members other than the union, who are in partnership with the EU. So a private member is any legal entity established under public or private law that is a member of one of these industry associations. I think this is quite self-explanatory. That private member is built up of constituent entities and affiliated entities. Constituent entities you can think of as an individual company, such as in the medical technology field, who is a member of the MedTech Trade Association, who's one of the private members. An affiliated entity would be someone who's actually linked with that. The one I would pay the most attention to for the purposes of this conversation is the contributing partner. Now, these contributing partners are not private members, and they're not constituent entities, and they're not affiliated entities. They're separate from the trade associations generally. And essentially, the contributing partners are interested legal entities from outside the traditional private members, usually. And what they do is they have a particular interest in topics that IHI is actually doing, and they join and apply for status with the IHI joint undertaking in order to contribute to topics and the larger strategic goals of IHI. So they submit a letter of application to IHI, basically saying that who they are, what their interest is, which particular topic that they want to contribute to, and the what they're actually bringing. They can contribute either financially or they can contribute what we call ECOP, which is in kind towards operational activities. So this is a continuation of the IMI2 associated partner program, where essentially we had about 200 million in terms of in-kinds contributed by the larger funding foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust and the Simon Foundation. This is actually very useful because it allows additional resources to be brought to projects by these other parties who are very interested in the various topics that IHI is actually doing. As we have a slight note at the bottom there, basically saying that contributing partners should submit a letter. This is clear. The letter should get to the IHIJU before the call submission deadline. Essentially, the earlier the better, because as I said, the letter needs to be reviewed by the IHI governing board before the contributing partner is accepted as a contributing partner. We'll cover this a little later on. For the purposes of these discussions, however, in case you've already seen this referred to, contributing partners can contribute towards the 45% in-kind contribution as well, but we'll talk about that a little later on, and Gail's going to cover this in a lot more detail at the financial webinar tomorrow. And just because we were talking about in-kind, so this will be covered in a lot more detail tomorrow, but very briefly to frame our conversation. In terms of contributions that would come from either the private members or contributing partners, we have three types. We have the in-kind contributions to operational activities, and they're obviously contributed by both the private members and the contributing partners. Then we have financial contributions that we can think of essentially in cash, whereby cash or funds are transferred from the private member or the contributing partner to another beneficiary to allow that beneficiary in the project to complete specified tasks or do particular work. And then we have in-kind to additional activities. This is a little different. It's kind of seen as more supporting funding or in-kind, which can be put in place. It's not directly part of project activities, but it can be in support of projects, and it can also be submitted theoretically a little bit after the project is actually finished. So it's a very, very useful way for bolstering or supporting the immediate work that the project has actually done. I mentioned it 2 slides ago, so we'll just cover this very, very briefly now. This is something which is the 45% eligibility criterion it's hard coded into the IHI legal basis. And essentially what it states is that if you essentially have a project proposal being submitted, and this would apply for our present single stage call, then you must supply 45% in-kind equivalence to the total cost of the actual project. So that first bullet point there, costs related to contributions, ECOP, EKA, and or financial contributions provided by the IHIJU, private members, and the IHI contributing partners shall amount to 45% of the sum of the total costs plus EKA. Now, I'm just going to highlight there because I said it 2 slides ago, and just to remind everyone, if you have contributing partners as part of your applicant consortia, then they can contribute towards the 45%. And indeed, we've already seen this approach in some of our previous calls. Again, a reminder: contributing partners cannot provide EKAA. This is one of the rules in the legal basis, but ECOP and financial contributions are not a problem. We check this a couple of times during the actual process. For the purposes of this conversation, we check it actually just at the submission stage, just at the evaluation part, where we make sure that the consortia who are applying with their proposals, whose proposals are going to be evaluated, we ensure that they have satisfied this 45% criteria. And it's an eligibility criteria. So if you don't hit the 45% threshold, then your proposal is not eligible. The advice that we are giving in the guide for applicants, which I suggest everyone who's on this call actually refers to, it's available on the IHI website. The informal advice we're saying is that it's better to aim for 50% just to allow a small margin of error, but the legal rule is 45%. And then the second slide on this, the first point just covers what I've already stated, where 50% is actually better. It's kind of a more prudent approach. Then into the IPR. So very briefly on this, we just felt it's important to cover because there's a couple of tweaks in the IHI legal basis in relation to intellectual property. Now, most of it, if you are familiar with the Horizon Europe intellectual property rules generally, then I think that most of this will be extremely familiar. And I'll come to a couple of points in the next slide where there are a couple of specificities. But just for the purposes of those who are maybe not familiar with this, or just to give some underlying language. So in relation to the IHI actions, essentially you have a couple of stages and a couple of particular terms that you should be familiar with. So background, which we have on the left-hand side, which is the orange box, this is essentially what is brought to and submitted towards the project by the beneficiaries or the participants themselves. So as we say, the background is defined in the model grant agreement, the standard agreement which everyone uses, in Article 16.1, and background means any data, know-how, or information, whatever its form, including intellectual property rights that is held by the beneficiaries before they acceded, before they joined the grant agreement, and is needed to implement the action or exploit the results. So it's very careful that what goes into the project, I mean, this is discussed before the project starts by all the beneficiaries, and it's agreed, and it's usually laid out in the consortium agreement. But the key point is that whatever is being brought in and whatever is identified as background, it needs to be clearly required for the project. It needs to be something useful. And this will be discussed at length during the formation negotiations before the actual project starts. So this usually isn't a point of contention. And as I said, it's normally then laid out and identified in the consortium agreement, which everyone signs as well. I'll come back to the consortium agreement in a later slide. And then in terms of how the actual project works, so as you can see on the right-hand side, the background is introduced first. That's our orange box, and it's right there from the very start, and it goes through right till the end. Using the background that the various beneficiaries bring to the project, then results are generated in the project. And as you can see, we've defined results again from the grant agreement, any tangible or intangible effect of the action, such as data, know-how, whatever its form or nature, whether or not it can be protected, as well as any rights, including intellectual property rights. So I think the best way to think of it is that if you think of the background, which is being fed into the actual project, and then results is what is coming out. And results are usually, the vast majority of results are identified or can be known or expected either before or during the actual project, which gives a degree of confidence to all the actual participants. But however, it is possible that something unexpected will come out as well. Any results which are generated in the project then are subject to access rights, and the access rights can best be defined as who and when can use the background and the results. So if you are bringing background to the project, you are basically giving everyone else in the project access rights to that background so that they can use your background to do work in the actual project, so they can do their own tasks. One thing that you should be aware of, and it should give confidence, is that if you actually generate, if you bring background to the project or you generate results, that does not mean other beneficiaries are then allowed to commercialize either your background or your results. So you have a degree of confidence there. The access rights that we're talking about basically pertain specifically to project activities, what's actually happening in the actual project, what people's jobs are. If someone wants to actually commercialize what you're actually either bringing or what you've produced, then that's a totally separate matter for you and the person who wishes to exploit those assets. And then just in relation to some of the specificities I mentioned a second ago. So the Horizon Europe, as I said, the legal basis, the standard intellectual property rules apply with a couple of tweaks. Our IPR rules, our intellectual property rules, are derived from the model grant agreement, specifically Article 16. One thing I would flag here is that in the actual model grant agreement, it's quite thin. I would recommend anyone who's digging into this to source on Google the annotated model grant agreement, which takes the basic grant agreement, which is about 100 pages long, and adds a couple of 100 pages of explanations, best practice, case studies, etc. And the IPR section there is actually very useful. And I'd secondly flag, when we talk about IHI, because IHI is not completely standardized Horizon Europe, it's important that first you look at the general intellectual property rules in the grant agreement, then you go into Annex 5, which has a specific section for joint undertakings, and then there's a subsection in there for IHI. So you just need to make sure that if you're digging into this particular area, that you're looking at the right sections. And indeed, those 3 points there, as I said, we have the standard Article 16 in the grant agreement, then you have the Annex 5 that I just talked about, and then where relevant for certain situations, then we can have applicable call conditions as well. We can have additional language put into the text of either the call or the work program. This third main bullet point here, which is important, which we get a lot of questions on, which everyone needs to be aware of, is that IHI, the joint undertaking, we maintain the right to object to transfers of results or to grants of exclusive licenses. So if results are actually generated in an IHI project, then strictly speaking, if you want to transfer transfer those results or grant exclusive licenses of those results to legal entities who are outside the EU and the associated countries, etc., then IHI does actually have a right to object if we find it's incompatible with the larger strategic concerns of the European Union. Now, I can say for the vast majority of IHI projects and the vast majority of IHI participants, this is not a concern, but it's something that everyone should be aware of. It's something that if you have questions in relation to, you should contact the IHI office ahead of time, contact the legal team, and we'll be happy to discuss it with you. But if we flag it up front, then I think everyone's in a stronger position to understand what the potential obligations and the potential outcomes are. Next point, the results ownership. This is something which is produced at the end of the project and will essentially identify all the results. You'll remember that I said a couple of slides ago that the results are the tangible or intangible outputs of the project, the stuff that has been generated in the various work packages of the project. That will be an exhaustive list of all the actual projects or all the project results, and it will also show who's the owner of them. So generally, in terms of results, the beneficiary that generated that specific result in the project is from the start the owner. It is possible to have joint ownership, as we refer to there, but the results ownership list clearly identifies everything that's been done and who holds legal title to those results. Lastly, then, one of the changes from IMI 2, which everyone needs to be aware of, which you should look at, is that there is an emphasis now in IHI and the larger Horizon Europe architecture on exploitation and open science. So we do integrate the open science dissemination model. Secondly, Plivius mentioned these a few minutes ago, which is the affordable access provisions. So for this call, which is call 3 for topics 1, 4, and 5, there are additional provisions or obligations for these topics for the projects that end up working in those areas. What I would do is I would refer you to, when it's available at the end, the work program, which will have those specific obligations for topics 1, 4, and 5 in there. It's not too onerous, but it's important that everyone understands it right from the actual start. And again, if there's queries on this, after you've taken a look at the actual obligations, just I'd suggest first you check the FAQ, which we actually have available on the IHI website. Check the guide for applicants, and then if there's further questions, then you can of course submit a question to the IHI legal team as well. To be fair, to this point, we have received quite a few questions on affordable access provisions thus far, so we're happy to discuss it with potential applicants ongoing. Lastly, unexploited project results can be matched with interested parties via the yes. If we have results which are generated in the projects which beneficiaries aren't particularly interested in exploiting, though they have an obligation to, basically then they should be matched with potential parties in the Horizon Results platform, and that's explained in the grant agreement. Just in red underneath, we've added this as a result to a lot of the questions we've actually received. So I've mentioned this very, very briefly, and I'll cover this a little later on, but I've kept talking about the model grant agreement, which is what everyone signs. The grant agreement is signed by all the project beneficiaries and IHI. And you can think of it as the main legal document where the high level obligations for the project are laid out and codified and everyone signs up to. In parallel with the grant agreement, there is the consortium agreement. Now, IHI does not sign the consortium agreement because the consortium agreement is literally a document whereby everyone who's participating in the project, the beneficiaries, essentially lay out the day-to-day functioning of that particular project. So who's going to look after governance, who's going to do which work package. I mentioned earlier that you can list the background if you want to put it into Annex 1, who's bringing what assets to the actual project. A lot of the detail for the day-to-day managing of the intellectual property goes into the consortium agreement as well. And Polybius will mention this a bit later on, I think, but there's a number of templates available. So this is, potential applicants don't have to worry about drafting this document all on their own. There's quite a lot of support already available online. And from call to grant award, I think Polybius, you're going to take this part, right?
Right, Desmond, thank
Super.
you. We can go to the next slide. So after the call application and the submission deadline, the admissible and eligible proposal will go through the evaluation phase. So each proposal actually will be assessed by the minimum 3 independent experts. But due to the complexity of our call, the size of the budget, the technical nature of the subject, the cross-sectorial considerations, we aim with a high number of experts from 5 to 7, I would say. So each proposal will be evaluated as it is. Therefore, you should explicitly mention and address all the requirements of the topic, and at the same time address all the elements included in the proposal templates. So the proposal will be assessed based on the evaluation criteria and sub-criteria, where you can find them in the evaluation forms. And each criterion is scored from 0 to 5. So we have excellence, impact, and implementation. Each criterion has its own threshold, and the same applies for the 3 of them, 3 out of 5, but the total overall threshold should have 10. Therefore, even though you pass the individual thresholds for each criterion and you don't get 10, the proposal will be below threshold. One piece of advice for this specific subject. Actually, you should pay attention to the 3 evaluation criteria equally. You might consider sometimes that excellence and impact are quite challenging to be addressed, so you put more efforts and time to prepare them, but implementation also is equally important. And I would say, even though more straightforward to be addressed comparing to the other 2. So from our experience and so far, implementation plans are suffering, not because are complicated to prepare, but we think it's because applicants didn't allow sufficient time and attention to prepare them. And it is unfortunate that great proposals are penalized because of the implementation. So do not underestimate this criterion and organize in advance in order to address it properly. Next slide, please. The proposal consists of 2 parts and several annexes. The part A of the proposal is the online forms that you complete in the submission environment. So the IT systems generating this part A. In that part, include details about the participants. There, you should also pay special attention on the researchers table. It's very important to have accurate info and numbers, because this will be played also an important role in case we have equal scores. The number of researchers will be actually calculated, and then the prioritization process of the equal scores will be based on that. Of course, we have the budget where we will go through in order to calculate the 45%, which is eligibility criterion, the information of ethics and security, and also information on clinical studies. The part B is a narrative part, is a PDF that the coordinator should upload in the submission environment. The structure there is based also on the criteria, the excellence, impact, and implementation. So you really need to carefully read the proposal template and address all the specific requirements. Now we're moving to the annexes. Of course, IHI is operating under Horizon Europe. We have the Horizon Europe annexes, but we have also some specific ones to IHI. The type of participant annex, which is specific to IHI, it's an Excel table. Even though it's not assessed, is not evaluated, there is really important to provide information about the type of the participants of the consortium, because this will not only help us to calculate some specific KPIs for IHI, but also will help us to count the 45% eligibility criterion. So please prepare them carefully, provide all the information in order to facilitate our work in terms of the calculation of the 45%. Importantly, the coordinator should sign the declaration of in-kind contribution commitment on behalf of the full consortium. If this declaration is missing, unfortunately, the proposal cannot be processed. So we need to come back to you on this specific aspect. Another one annex specific to IHI is the in-kind contribution to additional activities. So the experts will be instructed not only just to see numbers of IKA, they need also to assess from the qualitative perspective these activities and how they contribute to the project. So there we need to have sufficient information to go through during the evaluation process. Once again, the essential information for the clinical studies, the dedicated annex for core 3 is compulsory. So for these proposals envisaging clinical studies, you should complete and upload this specific annex. Now you have the ethics annex. This is an optional and is required only when you do the ethics self-assessment in part A, and there is also some minimum characters, but you need to provide more information in order to allow experts during the ethics screening to tackle all the specific assessments. So more information on the ethics when required is very welcome, because this will facilitate the ethics assessment process. Next slide, please. For this specific slide, I will not go in details. Of course, it doesn't cover all of it. We have the grant agreement phase with the selected proposal, which is an online process, and it's covered and it's we go through with the coordinator, not with the specific participants. And just to mention that for the consortium agreement, check our website. We'll have templates provided by our members, but also we'll have the DESCA one. Next slide, please. Regarding the timelines, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we're now moving towards this week, towards the call publication. Stay on hold. We'll have everything available also in our website, in the Fundings and Tenders portal, where you can find the full topic text. And please read carefully the topics and the call conditions. So the deadline for the call 3 will be mid-March 2023. The evaluation will take place in April 2023. When we'll have the evaluation results, we'll go through a lengthy process in terms of finalization, and then with adoption of the results from the governing board of IHI, and by June, by June, all applicants at the same time will be informed about the evaluation results. The selected ones will go through the grant agreement preparation phase, where we need by end of September to sign the grant agreements. Next slide, please. Moving now towards the end, we'll give you some points to remember while preparing your proposal. All relevant material will be available in IHI website. Guide for applicants to really well-drafted document where you can go through all the aspects that we covered today, but also on the financial and budgetary step-by-step process of the proposal. It's important now to start thinking about how to form your consortium. Read the topic text. All the information will be in the Fundings and Tenders portals and also in our website. And start thinking like evaluators. It's very important to explicitly address all the requirements of the topic, along with the proposal template, in order to facilitate the work of the experts. As mentioned, the proposal evaluated as it is. It's really important to give all this information without creating any doubts. Experts cannot see the potential of the proposal, but evaluate what they see actually on the paper. And of course, along with the page limit, which is 50 pages for the research and innovation actions. Go check the evaluation forms, see the evaluation sub-criteria, pay special attention also to the ethics self-assessment in order not to create doubts or questions to the expert during this process. Even though 45% is an eligibility criteria, you should aim to go at least to the 50%, because this criterion will follow the selected proposals along the lifetime of the project. So things might change. So you shouldn't risk go below the 45%, because there will have an unfortunate outcome. So you really need to have at least this 5% security that can give you this stability during the project lifetime. Also, once again, the researcher table in the part B should be carefully filled in, ensure the gender balance, because this might influence the ranking while having equal scores. And where applicable, the gender equality plan should be also self-declared and also checked by IHI afterwards. And this is an eligibility criterion. Pay special attention. And of course, while you're selecting your coordinator, be sure that it's financially viable. So the coordinators should be checked in advance that they have the financial viability, that they're financially viable. You can find all the information in the guide for applicants and the specific links to check it, because if finally you're selected for funding, the coordinator, if it's not financially viable, in principle should be replaced. So there will take longer process to go through this new assignment. And of course, for any questions that you might have on the topic, please contact IHI in applicants functional mailbox and don't go through any other channels regarding these topics. Next slide, please. Of course, any question you may have for any aspect of the call for proposals, contact us in applicants@ihi.europa.eu and feel free to contact also the state representative group of your country. All the information for the main delegates are available in our website. Next slide. Before actually closing and moving to the Q&A session, I would like also to take this opportunity and call also for experts. Because in IHI, we're always looking for new competent experts in diverse fields. You see the topic, you see the call. If you consider you have the relevant expertise, please go create your experts profile in the funding and debtors portal. You can have here the link and email us with your expert profile number, and we'll go through and check if you have the expertise required for the specific topic and call, and then you might be the next evaluation expert in our call. Next slide, please, which brings us to the end, and now we can actually open the Q&A session. I think, Rui, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Polyvius. Thank you, Desmond, for your presentations. We have a few questions on the chat. I'll try to group the questions by topic. So there was a lot of questions regarding how or how people can meet partners. So, for example, on which platform can do potential applicants approach the IHI industrial partner investors with their project ideas? What's the best practice, and how to deal with highly confidential and business issues at this stage with them? Desmond, Polyvius, who would like to answer?
I mean, okay, so to break that question into parts, I think Polyvius and I will have to take a part each. So the first thing to bear in mind is IHI is actually launching the calls. This is actually completely true. However, we are not constructing consortia or putting them together. So essentially, if there are potential applicants on this actual call and they have a fantastic idea for a project in relation to a proposal, then it's incumbent upon them to reach out, to use their networks, to use their contacts, to get in contact with other legal entities, whether it's companies, industry, or whether it's other academic institutions, or whether it's potential contributing partners who may have an interest in this and who would be interested in joining a consortia, putting together a proposal, contributing in kind, and building that proposal out. So I mean, it's very much in terms of addressing the call and putting together your consortia outside of the organized IHI events like the brokerage events, etc., which are always advertised and they're publicized on our websites. It's very much a applicant-led process. We obviously, as IHI, provide some of the tools whereby some contacts can actually be made, but it is very much in the hands of the individual applicants to use the initiative and build their consortia. Would that be the general consensus, Polyvius?
Yes, of course, and just to complement on this, we have also the pitching sessions where it's a floor for potential applicants to advertise themselves and see also the others, so can establish contacts for this search of partners. And there's also free to reach out to the industry, to the members, to use their networks, like you said, and see how they can form this specific aspect.
Yeah, and then just in relation to the highly confidential point, I mean, and this will probably emphasize what I was saying, that IHI, we're not the gatekeepers when it comes to getting access to or liaising with the industrial partners. If you have some, I mean, this is anecdotal, but in my experience, the industry members who are involved in IHI projects are always very open to innovative and new ideas. So if you have something particularly interesting or something that you think could be highly viable, I mean, you can have those discussions, I would imagine, via a confidentiality agreement whereby these preliminary discussions can actually be had to facilitate conversation before a formal proposal is prepared. So there are mechanisms there, and it is possible. And the single stage calls, we've really seen this in IHI where the consortia are self-organizing almost organically and coming together to put together proposals. So there are a number of approaches and tools you can use.
Great. Thank you very much, Desmond. Thank you very much, Polyvius. You'll just take the next question, which is there a limit to the share of contributing members in the consortium? How long before the proposal submission does the application letter for contributing partners need to be submitted to the IHI governing board?
Okay, so there's a couple of points here, which I'll just when the question says, is there a limit to the share of contributing members? I'll approach that in two ways. The first one is I presume they're talking about contributing partners, but if they're not, then don't worry, I'll cover that as well. So strictly speaking, there's no limit to either. IHI have had in the past and will have in the future very large consortia with a high number of participants. So we don't have a cap on how many people can sign the grant agreement. I mean, as I said, because consortia are self-organizing, it becomes a self-policing issue where you basically identify, look, these are the things that need to be done in the consortium, if it's funded per the proposal, and these are the various entities who are going to do it. Therefore, this is the cap. This is our self-imposed cap on the number of participants we need. So that's if we're talking about either contributing partners or contributing members, because contributing partners then, they're generally going to become a beneficiary. They're going to join the actual grant agreement. They're going to contribute in kind. They're going to contribute towards the 45%. So again, it becomes self-regulating. So I think what we can say is, in terms of the hard rules, no, there's no cap. In relation to practice, I think there's always that self-regulation. And then the second part of the question was, how long before the proposal submission does the application letter for CPs need to be submitted? What I would say is, if you are either a potential contributing partner or you want to bring in contributing partners to your proposal, frankly, I would say the earlier the better. I'll tell you why. Because, as I said, it's vitally important that IHI has an idea before the submission deadline of A, how many contributing partners are coming in, and B, what they're contributing. Because if they're contributing to the 45%, then we need to know that this is a viable contributing partner. So from a practical everyday piece of advice that I can give, what I would say is, if you have potential contributing partners lined up, contact the IHI office, specifically the IHI legal team. But you can contact the legal team through the infodesk facility or the applicant's functional mailbox. And what you can do is then you can reach out to the IHI legal team. Carolina, who's our contributing partners expert here in IHI, she then can guide the applicant contributing partner in relation to the production of the letter. She would basically say now that all the template letters for the contributing partners are on the IHI website at the moment, and there's a particular template letter for single stage IHI calls. And in the coming days, I think it's just in the last stages of finalization and fact checking and word checking, the contributing partners guide will be in that same place on the website as well. So there's quite a few resources there. But I cannot emphasize this enough. We need to know well ahead of time if your applicant consortium has contributing partners, who they are, whether they're viable contributing partners, have they submitted a letter to the IHI undertaking, and what they are bringing, whether they're planning to bring financial contribution or in kind. If you satisfy those criteria, then I think you will be in good shape in terms of your CPs, because it allows us to identify any problems well ahead of time.
Desmond, also to add on this specific thing, that it's not about also a number of the private members or contributing partners within the proposal. So it's not only about figures and how much contribution they bring, it's also what they actually bring in terms of the expertise per se. because the experts will assess the nature of the public-private partnership. So it's not bringing members or contributing parties inside the consortium to satisfy the 45%, but the expertise of these partners, of these members, what is the added value, what they will bring to the proposal will be assessed from the qualitative perspective. So it's important these two aspects, contribution and expertise, is matching well in order to be positively assessed. And yes, for the contributing partners, we really need it before the call submission deadline for the 45%. And I will take this opportunity once again to emphasize the importance of the annex of the type of participants, the one that I described and mentioned before. There you should identify who are your members and who are your contributing partners in order to allow us more straightforward exercise in terms of the 45% eligibility criterion. Thank you.
Thank you, Polybios. Thank you, Desmond. We do have a few questions regarding the 45%. So concerning the 45%, only contributions from IHI affiliate companies will count towards the 45%. And what if we include another company, SME, that's not part of one of the IHI partners?
Yes, so I think this goes to, I mentioned this earlier, because now we have two different types of calls. IMI was almost exclusively the two-stage construction. We have the single stage and the two-stage now. So call 3, we're talking about a single stage application process. So that 45% can be contributed, I mean, by essentially industry legal entities who are joining the consortium. So it can come from contributing partners. It can come from a number of sources, and it's the responsibility of the entire consortium. So I think the question is proceeding from the kind of the architecture of a two-stage, where, you know, in the two-stage we have this pre-identified industry consortium, which is brought from the private members, and they supply all the in-kind towards the 45%. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is single stage. So you can get your in-kind from a number of different sources, which can be industry, which can be contributing partners. And as I said in my previous answer, for call 1 in IHI, which was also single stage, we saw this a lot, where essentially you have consortia who want to hit the 45% criteria, who basically bring in a number 2, 3 contributing partners, you know, who are not necessarily aligned with the private members of IHI, who contribute in kind towards the 45%, and that hits the eligibility criteria. So it's the advantage of the single stage call. It's much more flexible in this way. And it gives an awful lot of options to applicant consortia to self-organize. And essentially, as long as I keep going back to contributing partners because I think it's going to be the most popular way. As long as the contributing partners will qualify as contributing partners, and as long as their contribution is eligible, and as I said, if you get in contact with the IHI office and you use your template letter, etc., and we establish this ahead of time, then it's clear whether your proposal is going to pass the 45% eligibility criteria, which Polybios mentioned at the evaluation stage. So no. I think the short answer to the question is no. You're not talking about just the private members supplying towards the 45% for the purposes of call 3.
Desmond,
yeah.
Also for this, I will make it a little bit more straightforward, meaning the 45% is coming either from private members or contributing partners or both. Any other contribution that is not coming from these categories, for example, an SME who is not part of the associations, which is not considered as a contributing partner, these amounts that we bring in the consortium is not counted against the 45%, but it will be indicating the budget as own resources, which is not part of the 45%. However, we increase the total cost of the project. If this SME would like to join an association in order to get the To be part of the 45%, this is another story. This is up to the specific applicant to go in a different channel. But for IHI will not be part of 45%. It will be own resources.
Yeah. Or even we could have the SME basically apply to become a contributing partner. And if they meet the rest of the contributing partner criteria, then that's a conceivable route as well. Exactly. So as we said, I mean, there's so much flexibility for the single stage in relation to how this is done. I think that's quite a comprehensive answer to what was a reasonably short question.
Okay, so we'll just take the next question. It's regarding the location, and it's about the US. If companies or an organizations based in the US is eligible for funding.
Okay, so I covered this actually on one of the first slides I did. So the USA, because it's not either an EU country or an associated country or a low and middle income country, US entities coming from the US, they are of course eligible and welcome to participate, but they are not automatically eligible for funding. It's conceivable, and this again I mentioned this in pretty much the same slide, it is conceivable that an entity coming from the US could be eligible for funding if they are bringing something absolutely essential to the actual project. And as I said, this would have to be detailed in the proposal as to why these guys are so essential, why we can't get it in, why we can't get what they're bringing in the EU. If they meet the essentiality criteria and the independent experts think that they are essential, then conceivably someone come from the US could be eligible for funding. But in our experience thus far, and maybe also going back to IMI too, usually what happens is US-based participants are more often coming as contributing partners and contributing in kind. But it's possible that they could be eligible for funding, yes.
Otherwise, DESMO will be associated partners. Where
that's possible too, yeah.
Exactly, can be associated partners. They can provide their own contribution. Of course, are not eligible for funding. They will not sign the grant agreement, but they will operate under the consortium supervision as a whole or under a specific participant. So depending on which way the applicants will try to go through, either associated partner or contributing partner, all with requesting funding. But like you said, it should be essential in terms of the expertise they bring that cannot be found in Europe. So this is the main element that the expert will be assessed.
Thank you, Polybios. And there's also a few questions regarding the UK and the funding. So could you please elaborate more on the UK academic participation? Are IHI calls treated as standard Horizon Europe, where there is a guarantee? And also if UK entities are eligible for funding.
Okay, well we can deal with both in the same breath. So I think the short, honest, blunt answer here is that no, there's no guarantee. So and as I said, every consortium that has UK participants in it in the proposal has to think about this. So the current situation, the compromise, which I think is quite logical given the larger political situation, is, as I said, if your proposal, if your applicant consortium has UK participants in there, to be as flexible as possible, IHI, in line with the wider Horizon Europe approach, is basically assuming that these guys will be eligible for funding, at least for the purposes of the submission and the evaluation. So we treat these UK participants as fully eligible participants for funding. Now, what will happen is if your submission is accepted and funded and you go through the competitive stage to the next round and you're getting your grant agreement ready, IHI, along with everyone else in the Commission and the EU, will do a check when it comes up to grant signature, when grant signature approaches, and we will say, has the political situation now been resolved, and are the UK able to receive funding from us? So if the simple situation is, if I was doing a grant tomorrow, if we had something launching next week, There has been no political progress between the EU and the UK. Therefore, at the moment, for the purposes of grant signature, UK participants are not eligible to receive funding. So what would happen is then there would have to be some practical choices made by the actual consortium in relation to what's going to happen for the UK participants. So because as we understand it, and again, this is anecdotal, there's a working practice in the UK whereby UK participants can receive funding from the UK government themselves, which is kind of similar to the Swiss model. But we haven't received any information on that, and we haven't received any good reassurances in relation to that. So if you are a UK participant and you want to join a consortium, this will be brought up by the rest of the consortium, and it will need to be understood that, okay, for the purposes of the evaluation, the IHI funding is actually there. But if there's no political progress, you will not receive funding from IHI when it gets to grant agreement signature. And obviously, this is something that we will be looking at for those successful proposals as a grant agreement signature time approaches. Plivios, do you have anything to add to that?
In practical terms, we need to sign the grant agreement by next September.
Yeah.
From the political point of view, and all this kind of negotiations still for the association agreement is not there. So applicants should be really prudent on this, on how to select the consortium in terms of the UK participants and requesting funding.
Yeah.
So either they have to go through the UK government, or they are very welcome to be part of the consortium. They will be treated as eligible for funding, but then by September, everything should be sorted out in terms of the funding or not, based on the results of the association agreement. So, yeah.
Great. And just because there's a related question here, we skipped it by mistake. So there's a question here saying, is Israel considered an associated country? So indeed, Israel are identified as an associated country to EU. There is an association agreement in place. Therefore, if you're coming from Israel, then you're eligible for participation and funding. And again, this is just one of these topics that I'd really refer everyone to just Google, just find it online, the Horizon Europe program guide. It's super useful for this kind of information, and it's got lots of practical examples and lists of who's eligible and who's not, etc. And you would find it a great resource. I think if you had that and the IHI guide for applicants and the annotated model grant agreement, if you had those documents sitting side by side, and maybe the financial guidelines which Gail has produced, I think you'd be in a really good shape for this stage of the process.
Thank you very much, Desmond. So the next question is, if our hospital is already involved in a clinical trial with a pharma company, can that company apply with us in this IHI call? Are we then considered not independent?
Oh, okay. So that's interesting. So when we talk about independent, when we talk about an independent legal entity, I think it's important to just, what we're talking about here is the legal status of that. We're talking about a hospital, so we'll just say a hospital. So if you're involved in a clinical trial with a pharma company, you are still legally independent. There may be a link or a collaboration agreement between you and the pharma company, and this happens all the time, and IHI recognizes that. But for the purposes of the eligibility criteria, etc., you would still be classified as an independent legal entity, providing, and I don't think this is a realistic scenario, but just in case, you're an independent legal entity so long as, for instance, the pharma company doesn't have a majority shareholding in your hospital. I don't think that's likely on this side of the Atlantic. So that's the difference. To be considered for the purposes of eligibility, independent entity is, have you essentially got your own legal basis or your own legal status, memorandum and articles of association, or your own company constitution, depending upon what kind of body you are. But any collaboration agreements and such don't count towards, don't impinge upon a legal entity's independence.
Thank you very much, Desmond. Polybius?
Here about the eligibility for participation, of course, they can participate, but also in the single stage call, in a nutshell, everyone is eligible for funding in terms of small, medium, or larger companies. So it's up to this entity to consider who actually will be part of the consortium. So it's only to consider the participation of the funding together.
So we have another question, which is, what's the definition of a normal partner?
I mean, to reiterate what Plivio said, I mean, strictly speaking, under the single stage architecture that we're talking about now, I mean, everyone within reason is eligible for participation and funding. So normal, and you'll recall, I think it was the second slide I did, general examples of participants here can be either a hospital or you know, an SME or larger industry. Single stage is very, very flexible. So as long as I said you have your own, you know, legal constitution or your own entity, then I think you would be regarded as normal. I don't think, I've never seen a situation where, you know, a type of legal entity has applied to a IHI and we go, no, that's not part of our philosophy, or we don't think they'll be a fit, because essentially it's going to be the consortia who are applying under the calls, who are submitting proposals, who are basically going to say, this is the kind of entity that we want, this is the kind of expertise that we want.
Thank you, Desmond. And we have another question about if you are participating in an EU-funded project with Horizon 2020 project funds, are you eligible to be a beneficiary in an IHI project?
I mean, generally, yes. Because I mean, we have multiple beneficiaries who are involved in multiple projects. So, if you are applying to an IHI project, then for all intents and purposes, it's a separate issue from the H2020 project that you are doing elsewhere. There may be a very fringe case in relation to double funding, but I mean that's extremely unlikely. So I think the short answer to this is yes, you can be involved in multiple IHI or multiple H2020 projects without a problem.
If you have the full capacity to deliver your tasks.
Yeah, that's a good qualification. Yeah, if you can get the work done, then we're very happy to have you.
Thank you very much. So will the budget of Swiss consortium partners count toward the total cost of the project and towards the calculation of the 45%?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, so the short answer on this is, and I need to be very clear on this, because the Swiss government, as I said, is very good at meeting the costs of its participants, and because those participants are not receiving funding from IHI, then the Swiss participants' costs do not count towards the total costs, and therefore are not factored into the 45%. And I think I mentioned the FAQ a bit earlier. We're actually updating the FAQ on this particular point because that is an excellent question, and it's something that we want to make sure everyone is aware of.
So, and we have a few questions related to funding. So, a question also for Desmond: is a university spin-out company in which the university takes an equity stake independent of the university as defined in the IHI?
Yeah. So, yes. So, oddly, this actually would have been easier to answer if we were IMI or under Horizon 2020. Okay. So, strictly speaking, as I said, you're an independent legal entity if you don't have someone. This is a general rule, and if I would prefer to deal with the actual querist bilaterally, just to make sure we get all the nuances. But I'm making a couple of assumptions. The assumptions that I'm making is essentially this company was spun out from an existing fostering project from a university, that they have their own legal constitution, that they're limited by shares, and that the company has, or the university has taken an equity stake, as in they have some percentage of share ownership. So what I would say is, as a general rule, but I would really stress that this should be discussed with the IHI office to make sure we capture all of the specificities. As a general rule, if it's a minority stake. If it's less than 50%, we would still regard you as an independent entity. If, however, the university has taken a majority stake of issued share capital, then that's a separate matter, and then we would regard you pretty much as an extension of the actual university. There's also complications in relation to whether you are part of another corporate structure. If there's multiple spin-outs and they all have, which we've seen before, they all have shareholdings in each other. So the short answer I could say is it depends upon the percentage ownership of the issued share capital. The longer, probably better answer is just contact us in the legal team and we can discuss this bilaterally, and we can look at the structure and maybe have a quick look at your legal constitution, and maybe an extract from the public register as well, to have a look at how you're commercially structured, and then we would make a decision on this. But my gut feeling at the start would say that you're probably still an independent legal entity unless the university are really holding the reins very tightly.
Thank you, Desmond. We now have a question about IP. So can an industrial partner or beneficiary not receiving funding request IP on some results in order to protect their molecules technologies already patent with the agreement of all the consortium members? And what are the criteria for IHI to object to this IP share?
Okay, so a couple of points which let me just revisit what I said in the previous shares before we jump into this. So strictly speaking, if you are bringing something to the project, and I noticed that the querist is actually talking about results. So if you're bringing something to the project or you're generating something in the project, which is the results, the IHI IP rules don't allow someone to commercialize that. So if I produce something excellent in an IHI project, Rui, who is sitting here beside me, can't take those results and go off and make a fortune selling them. That's the rules are very, very clear on that. There's no commercial exploitation. But the access rights, you are obliged to grant access rights to everyone in the project, but it's so they can get specific tasks, their identified tasks done in the actual project, and that covers for background and for results. So what I would say is these detailed IPR matters. There's always, if your submission is successful at the evaluation stage and you're going to be funded, there is what we call the gap negotiation phase, which is where the consortium that has come together basically says, okay, how are we going to handle practical matters like IP? So I would say that there are mechanisms in place to protect the IP. I'd say that it can be further nuanced via the consortium agreement if there's something particularly sensitive. IHI, we don't want to see your trade secrets. Obviously, we will see a description of what's happening in the projects, in the description of action for the project and in the work packages. And a results list will actually be generated. But I think I think every beneficiary who is getting involved in an IHI project can be secure that anything which they have, which is proprietary and highly sensitive, A, can be protected under the rules, B, they can get additional security through the consortium agreement, C, neither myself or any of the IHI staff are going to be looking through your IP.
Thank you, Desmond. And we are just have a few more questions to take. So can IKAA be used to fund activities related to sustainability of the project, which can be reported after the project ends?
Well, I mean, EKA, one of the beauties of EKA is that indeed it can actually be directed towards sustainability of a project when the project's over, for a period of actually 2 years. So I think the short answer here is yes, but maybe with a couple of caveats, which is that EKAA has to basically be approved by the IHI governing board. So it's something that needs to be sufficiently high level. It needs to be at a certain, to a certain point divorced from the operational realities of the actual project, and then if it meets those criteria, then I think if it's something which is kind of more broadly supportive of the project, then I think it would be justified. But this would be a decision for the IHI governing board themselves to say yes, this looks appropriate, or no, this doesn't look appropriate.
So we'll just take 2 more questions, and this is related to ICOP. So how is a non-EU ICOP perceived?
Rui, before going to the next question,
Yes.
regarding the IKA, in our website, there is a very nice description and guidance and instructions on how to fill in the IKA plan in in the single stage, but it's not only instructions how to do the exercise, but there is some background with practical examples of what IKA is at a project level. So there you can find all this information that can help you how to structure the IKA activities. So visit that specific link in our website, and then you will find more information. In case you have more questions, you come back to us.
Great. Thank you very much, Polyvios. So we just put the link in the chat if you want to check the document that Polyvios was mentioning. So the next question is, how is non-EU ICOP perceived? For instance, are the evaluators instructed to look into how non-EU ICOP is reflected in relation to the IP strategy?
Okay, actually, that's interesting. Actually, I have to say, I have to congratulate everyone's questions today. They're actually quite high level, and they're actually quite nuanced, which is encouraging for us. I think, I mean, it suggests to us that the basic rules are being absorbed, and now we're really getting into the details. So, in relation to this, I'd say 2 things. One, the evaluators, the independent evaluators who are going to evaluate the submissions, they're going to look at the non-EU. They're going to look at the ECOP overall and what it's actually doing. I mean, the non-EU ECOP is not going to be, something very specific it's not going to have unusual weight. They're basically going to say, look, what is the project trying to do? How well is the project responding and addressing to the challenges that are raised in the call topic text? What expertise is being brought, and what resources are actually being applied to it, in support of the academic and the professional expertise to address the challenges raised. So ECOP is obviously a component of that. I don't want to look into the mind of an independent evaluator. I don't think an independent evaluator is going to say, well, we want more ECOP from either EU or from non-EU, because for the purposes of this call, we have what's called a 100% limit on non-EU, so we can have a lot of non-EU, and I don't think the evaluators are going to attach a particular weight to if ECOP is coming either from the EU or it's coming from outside. In relation to the IP strategy, I mean, the IP strategy is obviously something that the independent experts will be interested in, because they'll want to make sure that these things are addressed. But in my experience thus far, I have never seen independent evaluators, take a line where or suggest that non-EU either should or should not be applied towards the IP strategy. I think that the larger question is this IP strategy suitable to get the tasks done in the actual project, and are they thinking about what's happening after the end of the project? And that's the approach. And then where the ECOP is coming from, the question is that ECOP going to achieve, the support of the IP strategy, rather than is it EU or is it not?
Desmond, on this, I'd like once again to emphasize that it's not all about figures, because the non-EU activities as activities will be assessed, because applicants will be required to describe the specific activities in a table in the part B of the proposal. So as far as I remember, it's in the implementation part. There is a specific table where the non-EU activities should be described, and their applicants should be thoroughly describe what non-EU bringing to the proposal and to the future project. So therefore, yes, will be assessed.
Thank you very much, Polyvios. So we just coming to the end, we'll just take one last question. which is in IHI single stage projects, also an industry project leader and an academic coordinator, as in IMI projects envisaged.
I think the difficult word there is envisaged. Under the grant agreement, it is envisaged and absolutely essential that there be a project coordinator. This is absolutely clear. In relation to the division of tasks where you have the project leader and then the academic coordinator, for a single stage, I would say that's very much at the discretion of the actual consortia and how they organize themselves. I think some consortia find it useful to have this distinction between the two, but for single stage, as Polybius and I have said, because it's so flexible and because you have these consortia who are self-organizing, we don't want to kind of mandate an architecture for them. So I think the short answer is no. It's not envisaged that you actually have this division. Some consortia might find it useful, some consortia may not, and under the single stage call, you have this flexibility to do that.
And of course, Desmond, this will not be assessed in terms of, in the evaluation. Like you said, it's up to the consortium to decide who will be the project coordinator, of course. The coordinator, like the other participants, will be assessed on the operational capacity and, like I mentioned, on the financial viability, how financially viable is to take this task and receive also the funding from IHI to distribute it to the rest of the partners. And I'm talking now about for-profit entities, because public entities, the financial viability check is not really applicable. So this is also points to consider. It's up to the consortium to decide the composition and the task of the coordinator, either it's industrial or academic lead.
Thank you very much, Polybius. Thank you very much, Desmond. We'll still take one last question to end the session. So the question is the possibility of 100% non-EU in kind somewhere be published? We had various contradicting information for call 1, and we would like to be sure about this regulation. Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas.
Oh, sure. So maybe I can give you a very definitive answer on this, but maybe the reason, based on some of the questions we've received so far for calls 1, 2, and now 3, I think what's maybe throwing the issue here is the limit. So strictly speaking, IHI, we need to have a limit, but for the purposes of calls 1, 2, and 3, so all of them so far, that limit is actually 100% non-EU in kind. So, and in relation to the source for that, if you go into, Polybius has referred to it already, the work program, which when the work program is released later this week, it will basically have the information on call 3, and it will basically state in there that the limit for non-EU is 100%, and that's where the ultimate authority on this point always is.
Great. Thank you very much, Desmond. Thank you very much, Polybius. All the presentations as well as the recording of the session will be online. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending the session. We're looking forward to seeing you at the other sessions.
Rui, once again for tomorrow, a reminder for the financial and budgetary aspects of the proposals with the webinar of Gael. If people haven't registered, please do so, because it will be in details on a step-by-step how to build your budget, and there the 45% eligibility criterion will be also presented on the practical terms, because IHI developed a budget tool which is also available in our website that helps you to really assess whether you have the 45% or not. So hopefully we'll see you also tomorrow.
Thank you.
Super.